The train clattered across the expansive American countryside, its metallic wheels producing a sound that echoed a military march. However, what truly disturbed the men crammed into its wooden compartments was not the strange landscape rushing past or the anxiety of their captivity. It was the music. As the doors momentarily opened at the last station, the unmistakable notes of a lively brass band drifted in. Trumpets blared, clarinets danced, and a smooth rhythm section provided a carefree beat. The German soldiers exchanged bewildered looks. Was that jazz? They had come expecting something entirely different. Months of relentless warfare, enemy shelling, and Nazi propaganda had led them to believe that American captivity would be harsh and unforgiving, perhaps even degrading. The Führer's radio broadcasts had depicted America as a nation of moral decline, chaos, and violence. Yet here they were, packed into a train heading deep into the United States. The first sounds they encountered were not the shouts of guards or the mechanical commands of labor, but music. Not just any music, but the decadent, forbidden variety, syncopated, liberated, and rooted in black culture. The men arrived at Camp Hearn in Texas, or Camp Alona in Iowa, or possibly a facility in Colorado. Their destinations varied, but their astonishment was the same. As they stepped off the train under the vigilant gaze of armed guards, most of whom appeared relaxed and donned wide-brimmed hats instead of steel helmets, they observed something else unusual. Near the entrance, a wooden bulletin board displayed a daily agenda. In addition to work assignments and mealtimes, it included listings for movie nights, music hours, and most perplexingly, recreation hall swing jam. Most of these men had marched through scorched fields in Europe, stood in formation for hours under harsh commands, and listened to propagandists caution them about the corrupting effects of American culture. Now, beneath the Texan sun or Kansas sky, they were witnessing something entirely different. There were neatly arranged rows of barracks, latrines that were odorless, Red Cross parcels organized in storerooms, and even American officers who smiled. However, the true surprise came from the air that flowed through the open windows of the command building where the radio was broadcasting. Once again, there it was. Benny Goodman, or perhaps Glenn Miller, with the gentle sound of a clarinet rising above the daily operations hum. Some men instinctively tensed, repelled by the music's unfamiliar freedom. Others were tentatively intrigued. For a few, those who had previously been musicians, or who had clandestinely listened to forbidden swing records in Hamburg or Cologne, the sound rekindled something long forgotten. A memory, a heartbeat. At times, the guard's loudspeaker, typically used for announcements, played popular songs between roll calls. The melodies resonated across the open fields. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Artie Shaw. For men conditioned to believe that the state was paramount and that rhythm could only serve the march, the notion that music could nourish the soul was both novel and unsettling. The initial days were overwhelming, not solely due to the lengthy journey or unfamiliar landscapes. It marked the onset of a peculiar re-education, not imposed through lectures or pamphlets, but through the surrounding culture. Some prisoners dismissed the sounds as psychological manipulation, convinced that the Americans were attempting to brainwash them. Others were less certain. They found themselves humming tunes they did not recognize. They gazed too long at the radio, feigning indifference. And at night, while lying on bunk beds and staring at the wooden ceilings, they could still perceive the faint echoes of swing drifting across the camp. One prisoner, writing home a month later, described it as a form of hypnosis. He was uncertain how to interpret the grinning guards tapping their boots to the rhythm, or the fact that even in captivity, there appeared to be joy. It was not what he had been led to believe. And that was merely the beginning. By the third week, the radio had ceased to be mere background noise. It had evolved into a significant presence. Each camp maintained its own schedule, yet many adhered to a comparable framework. The day commenced with morning roll call, followed by work detail assignments, breakfast, and subsequently an hour of radio time in the communal hall, a privilege granted under the ambiguous provisions of the Geneva Convention regarding cultural access. Initially, numerous PS dismissed or overlooked this opportunity. However, as time progressed, the melodies became more entrenched in their minds. Camp newspapers, published in German and often curated by the inmates themselves, but overseen by American censors, occasionally included brief articles about the popular music broadcasted on the airwaves. Some prisoners started to compile informal rankings of their preferred songs. Names such as Ella Fitzgerald and Nat King Cole began to surface in discussions, even though few could identify what these artists looked like. The guards were indifferent to this development. In fact, some appeared to take pleasure in explaining it, even lending out old records and showcasing their personal portable players, which, despite crackling with static, were still capable of delivering a melody across the concrete floor. The true catalyst for this transformation was the introduction of libraries. By late 1943, American authorities, motivated by the War Department's morale officers, had commenced the distribution of books and records to P camps. This included not only German literature or political essays, but also vinyl albums. Crates labeled for morale purposes contained boxed collections of American jazz, swing, and orchestral pop. The more adventurous guards even instructed inquisitive prisoners on how to operate the record players. Among the Germans, some former educators, university students, and musicians took the initiative in cataloging the music, occasionally organizing listening sessions. One prisoner, Otto, had been a music teacher in Leipzig prior to the war. He had not played a clarinet in 2 years, and the sight of the American records reignited a quiet passion within him. With the camp commander's permission and subsequent encouragement, he assembled other musically inclined prisoners to create an internal music appreciation group. They would analyze rhythmic structures, take notes on melodies, and attempt to transcribe tunes they heard by ear onto borrowed sheet music. This was not merely a pastime. For many, it evolved into a means of survival. There were also tensions present. Not every German was willing to accept this new reality. Some hardliners in the barracks muttered ominously about cultural infiltration. They perceived swing as a virus, a mechanism of demoralization. Yet, even they could not resist tapping their fingers when Count Bay's orchestra found a groove. Something about that backbeat was resistant to opposition. Then came the moment that caught everyone off guard. One rainy evening at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the recreation hall hosted a rare request night on the radio. Each barracks submitted one American song to be played. Most chose predictable selections, such as Glenn Miller's In the Mood or Artie Shaw's Begin the Big Wine. However, one group made a cheeky request. Could Marlene Dietrich's Lily Marlene be played in English? The guards laughed. The request was approved. As Dietrich's smoky voice wafted through the camp, half the men stood motionless. She had been an icon back home, though now despised by the regime for her anti-Nazi views and immigration. Hearing her sing in English, slow, confident, and sultry, awakened something profound. For many, it was the first moment they comprehended how far from home they truly were. Yet, instead of despair, the emotion was complex. There was beauty in it, as well as defiance. By winter, the camps were not merely permitting music. They were starting to live by it. Radios crackled during meal preparation. Jazz set the rhythm for cleaning the barracks. Benny Goodman was as recognizable a name as Goering had once been. The music was not just playing. It was transforming the tempo of captivity. By the time the first snow blanketed the American heartland, another cultural frontier had quietly emerged behind the barbed wire. Film. What began as occasional reels shown by guards as a novelty or reward swiftly evolved into structured weekly events. The camp cinema night had become a regular event, a tradition. Prisoners would queue outside the recreation barrack, stamping their feet to stay warm, holding tin mugs filled with ersatz coffee or tea. Inside, folding chairs were arranged in close rows, blackout curtains drawn, and the old projector was brought in by a jovial corporal who had previously worked as an usher in Chicago. For many German PS, this represented their initial genuine exposure to the vast array of American cinema. Not merely propaganda films, although Frank Capra's Why We Fight series did circulate, but full-length Hollywood productions, including comedies, musicals, noir crime dramas, and even cartoons. Bugs Bunny, The Three Stooges, Ginger Rogers twirling in radiant black and white, Humphrey Bogart growling through a misty Casablanca. It was an overwhelming surge of imagery and storytelling that broke through the rigid narratives they had been indoctrinated with. The initial response for many was one of disbelief. "They are showing this to us," a former Wehrmacht officer murmured after viewing a screwball comedy filled with rapid-fire quips and slapstick chaos. "They believe this is genuine culture." Yet beneath the skepticism lay a sense of intrigue. American films did not adhere to hierarchy or solemnity. They celebrated the underdog, ridiculed authority, and thrived on spontaneity. Even the film stars, with their snub noses, quick wit, and sometimes unkempt appearances, contrasted sharply with the statuesque Aryan ideals depicted in the Reich's newsreels. And the women, spirited, sharp-tongued, and bold-eyed, both confused and captivated them. In certain camps, the screenings sparked intense discussions. One barrack would advocate for the artistic value of noir shadows and jazz-infused tension. Another would complain about the cultural toxicity of fast-talking women. However, beneath the surface, something subtle was changing. The very framework of storytelling was beginning to infiltrate their consciousness. It was not solely about what the film conveyed, but also about how it was conveyed. The camera shifted. Scenes transitioned swiftly. Dialogue flowed with rhythm. The rhythm, akin to the jazz that they had started to accept and even appreciate, moved in a manner that felt vibrant. Before long, inmates began to request particular genres. A list was made available every Monday morning, and individuals signed up to cast their votes. Westerns gained immense popularity. There was an element in the lone frontier justice that struck a chord with ex-soldiers. Musicals, however, were more contentious. Some openly mocked them, while others quietly hummed the melodies. The following day, camp authorities, acknowledging the unforeseen benefits of these sessions, initiated a pairing of film nights with re-education initiatives. After each screening, selected prisoners were invited to participate in a brief discussion group, where a German-speaking American officer or a Red Cross cultural liaison would ask open-ended questions. What do you believe this film conveys about freedom? Why did the characters make their choices? These were not interrogations. They were invitations to consider alternative perspectives. Occasionally debates erupted. Sometimes laughter ensued, but there was always engagement. While the Americans observed the PS were observing one another. Men who had previously shouted party slogans now showed hesitation. Others who had kept silent began to voice their thoughts. One mechanic named Helmet, known for his gloomy demeanor, astonished his bunkmates by quoting a line from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. "That's democracy," he remarked. The man shouted into the Senate chamber and no one silenced him. The projector transformed into more than just a machine. It became a portal, flickering and flawed, yet undeniable. Behind barbed wire through Hollywood film, German soldiers were witnessing an America that no speech or pamphlet could have imagined. Not everyone was persuaded. Some became more entrenched in their views. However, many began to quietly and gradually ponder, what if everything we were told was false? The shift from passive cultural exposure to active intellectual engagement did not occur instantaneously. It began gradually under the auspices of a program that the War Department referred to as the Special Projects Division. The official purpose was educational, aimed at providing German prisoners with access to literature, history, and civics to potentially expand their viewpoints, mitigate extremist ideologies, and instill democratic principles. However, the reality was significantly more intricate. It represented an initiative to win hearts through cultural means to counteract Nazi indoctrination, not through force, but through ideas. Jazz films and magazines were merely the starting point. After several months of captivity, selected PSWs were invited to voluntarily participate in discussion circles. These gatherings took place in repurposed Bereric classrooms equipped with chalkboards, pamphlets, maps, and German language books sent from New York. The subjects varied. One week might delve into the framework of the U.S. Constitution, while another could examine the causes of World War I, often revolving around themes introduced in recent films or radio broadcasts. A particularly provocative session followed the viewing of The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's bold satire that ridiculed Hitler. This was a daring decision by the American officers to show such a film to actual German soldiers, many of whom had recently displayed the swastika. The atmosphere during the screening was tense and uncertain. Some prisoners left in disgust or anger, while others remained, wide-eyed, nervously chuckling at Chaplin's absurd goose-stepping and nonsensical speeches. However, what transpired afterward was even more unexpected. During the post-film discussion, a spirited debate emerged between two factions. One group, composed of younger soldiers from rural Bavaria, contended that the film was disgraceful, arguing that it ridiculed authority and tradition. The opposing group, more urban and intellectual in nature, countered that perhaps that was the intention, and that authority warranted mockery. "If a man cannot be laughed at," one individual remarked slowly, "then perhaps he possesses too much power." These discussions reverberated beyond the classroom, and that evening, the barracks were alive with quiet conversations. For the first time, several men acknowledged their uncertainties, not only regarding the war, but also concerning the ideologies that underpinned it. The music had sparked their curiosity. The films had provided a glimpse into new perspectives. However, it was the inquiries and the deep exploration of ideas that truly resonated. The Americans seized this opportunity. An increased number of books were made available, including classics by Goethe and Schiller, to provide a sense of familiarity, alongside translated works from American authors such as Mark Twain and Upton Sinclair, as well as excerpts from Roosevelt's speeches. German-language newspapers like Der Auf, a publication produced by anti-Nazi Germans under U.S. oversight, were distributed extensively. Initially ridiculed, Der Auf quickly gained popularity, particularly after it began reviewing camp films and elucidating the origins of swing music, portraying it not as degenerate, but as a genuine expression of a multiracial modern democracy. Music appreciation evenings were soon complemented by lectures on American composers, African American history, and even political philosophy. Some prisoners who were initially resistant found themselves returning repeatedly, attracted not only by the content, but also by the approach. The Americans were not imposing beliefs upon them. They were merely providing exposure, allowing the power of comparison to effect change. And it did, gradually and unmistakably. One young soldier named Deere, who had arrived at Camp Shelby in Mississippi with a Hitler Youth Medal still concealed in his coat lining, began to maintain a journal. His early entries were filled with bitterness and suspicion. However, by the fourth month, he was quoting lyrics from Duke Ellington and writing about American jazz as a symbol of defiance. He requested a copy of the Declaration of Independence from his discussion leader. "Not because I believe in it," he wrote, "but because I need to comprehend why they do." It was not a utopia. Conflicts still erupted. Nazi loyalists continued to roam the barracks, instilling fear and creating divisions. Yet the cultural front was making progress. Swing music had evolved from mere noise into a form of art. Films had transformed into reflections of reality. And the discussions, which had once been polite skirmishes over language, were evolving into a revolution of thought. As spring blossomed across the campgrounds, another change occurred. This transformation was not directed by any military official or cultural representative, but rather emerged from the prisoners themselves. One afternoon at Camp Concordia in Kansas, an intriguing sound wafted through the compound. It did not emanate from a radio or a guardhouse loudspeaker, but rather from within the barracks. A clarinet, followed by a bass, and then unmistakably a snare drum tapping out the rhythm of a swing beat. This marked the first occasion the prisoners had played the music themselves. The band gradually took shape. Instruments were limited, yet the Red Cross and local communities, many of which supported peace programs out of both practicality and compassion, contributed old equipment. A dented trumpet, a chipped upright piano from a defunct church, a set of mismatched drums, and a violin missing 2 strings were among the donations. It was sufficient. The Germans embraced it with enthusiasm. Many possessed formal musical training. Education in Europe had focused on classical music and technical skills. Although they were not well versed in jazz, they compensated for this lack with their proficiency. Before long, they began to replicate what they had heard on records: Count Basie's horn lines, Goodman's clarinet solos, and the walking bass lines of American rhythm sections. They learned to swing not through reading, but by listening, through repetition, trial, and error, until they suddenly found their groove. They dubbed themselves the Rhythm Barrack. What started as a few tentative rehearsals evolved into full-scale Saturday night concerts held in the Recreation Hall. Initially, the audience was composed solely of prisoners, rows of men with arms crossed and brows furrowed, as if challenging the band to impress them. However, by the third week, the guards began attending as well, followed by the kitchen staff and eventually the camp commander. Everyone was eager to discover what was transpiring behind that makeshift stage of stacked footlockers and painted backdrops. They performed American Patrol, Little Brown Jug, and even attempted to adapt in the mood. When sheet music was unavailable, they improvised from memory or endeavored to piece melodies together by ear. From time to time, they infused their own interpretation, incorporating a pula rhythm or merging it with German folk tunes, resulting in a distinctly transatlantic creation. The outcome was not flawless, yet it was electrifying. Then, the dancing commenced. Some guards chuckled when it first occurred, as a tall Bavarian cook began tapping his boots during a clarinet solo. Shortly after, another man, with his arms crossed behind him, gently swayed in time with the music. Before long, pairs of prisoners rose, awkwardly bowed to each other and started to sway. It was not precisely the jitterbug, but it was undeniably a dance. They moved in sync, laughed at their missteps, and twirled one another with a kind of wild, unrefined joy. It felt surreal. Behind barbed wire in a hall designed to discipline minds and regulate routine, the very culture they had been taught to disdain was now coursing through their bodies. The prisoners constructed a small wooden sign above the entrance. Swing abenda entrit frei. Swing evenings free entry. One night, a new arrival appeared. A former SS officer, with a stern demeanor and an iron cross affixed to his shirt, stormed out during a concert. "Shameful," he muttered, "dancing like Americans." However, few chose to follow him. The majority remained, some even stomping their feet more vigorously. It was more than mere distraction. The music filled an emotional, psychological, and even physical void. These men, stripped of their identity, purpose, and direction, discovered in jazz not just rhythm, but also meaning. It represented freedom not defined by documents but by tempo, a call and response between horns, drums, and soul. In the improvisation, they uncovered something no lecture could impart: the realization that uncertainty could possess beauty. The Americans recognized it as well. The camp chaplain at Fort Custer noted in a letter home, "They play our songs now, and they play them well. I am uncertain if they believe in democracy yet, but I suspect they believe in swing." From that moment onward, Saturday nights were claimed by the music. The war momentarily paused at the edge of the dance floor. Outside the wire, the war continued unabated. However, for German prisoners assigned to work details in rural America, their daily existence provided unforeseen insights into a distinctly different type of battlefield, one characterized by the experience of freedom rather than mere theoretical discussions. Numerous PSWs were sent to farms, sawmills, or canning factories throughout the Midwest and South, as part of labor agreements that enabled them to aid the U.S. economy in return for wages and humane treatment. What they did not foresee was the cultural exchange that would occur. The labor was arduous, involving the transportation of grain sacks under the Iowa sun, stacking lumber in Minnesota, and harvesting peaches in Alabama. Yet it came with peculiar privileges, such as truck rides into town and rest breaks near soda fountains. They enjoyed occasional conversations, albeit brief, with American civilians, and there was always music present. Radios were ubiquitous, on tractors, in barns, in break rooms, and even in the trucks that transported them to and from the fields. The same jazz and swing melodies they had listened to in the camps now resonated from diners and gas stations. Bing Crosby's voice floated from grocery store windows, while Louis Jordan's jump blues reverberated through the walls of small-town dance halls. Through open barn doors on Friday nights, the PSWs caught glimpses of an entirely different world. Dance halls were established in VFW basements, school gymnasiums, or by the lakesides illuminated with string lights. These local gatherings were vibrant and full of life, featuring teenage girls in cotton dresses and young men in uniform, with community bands performing Duke Ellington and Artie Shaw beneath paper lanterns. Although the Germans were never allowed to participate, the non-fraternization rules were strictly enforced. They observed from behind fences or truck windows, listened from across parking lots, and felt the rhythm resonate in their chests. For many, this was the most perplexing moment thus far, as it appeared joyful. Not degenerate, not decaying, not dangerous, but simply free. In some towns, the situation escalated further. In Nebraska, sympathetic locals arranged musical demonstrations near the labor sites. American musicians, many of whom were either too young or too old for military service, were invited to perform swing concerts outdoors, within earshot of the P quarters. This was an unofficial effort to boost morale, disguised as entertainment, and it proved effective. A sergeant stationed at Camp Carson noted, "We believed the higher-ups wanted to ease their spirits. I think we merely got them dancing in their dreams. And it wasn't solely jazz anymore." The PS were now being introduced to country and western ballads, early blues, and even gospel choirs on Sundays. Music with profound American roots. They might not always grasp the lyrics, but the emotional essence was clear. Sadness, joy, longing, belief. It was a language that transcended borders. Some PS maintained small journals where they phonetically wrote down lyrics. Others created sketches of dance halls seen from a distance. Long lines of couples were silhouetted beneath hanging lamps, dresses swirling, brass sections shining in the light. One individual, Hans from Dusseldorf, illustrated the same scene 5 consecutive times. With each rendition, the fences in the foreground became less distinct. There were also incidents. A group of PS near Temple, Texas, engaged in a jitterbug imitation contest during their break, only to be scolded by an older guard who could not comprehend how prisoners could be laughing. However, most guards either ignored it or even joined in the applause. After all, many were just farm boys themselves, scarcely older than the men they were supervising. One guard even secretly provided a harmonica to the band leader at Camp Opalea, simply stating, "Don't reveal its origin." That harmonica, as it turned out, was featured in a blues number written by a prisoner, performed at their subsequent camp concert. The lyrics were straightforward in broken English, yet unforgettable. No home, no girl, no war to win, but music's loud and swing begins. Even amidst labor, even within the structured routine of captivity, the rhythm of American life permeated, not merely through lectures or pamphlets, but through melodies resonating over cornfields, through fleeting glimpses of small-town joy. For men brought up under the principles of discipline and purity, the vibrant, soulful rhythm of America felt both foreign and captivating. It required no explanation. It simply needed to be experienced. Within the confines of the camps, the sounds of jazz and swing continued to resonate through loudspeakers and barrack radios. However, a different phenomenon was unfolding, one that was quieter, more personal, and potentially more lasting. The prisoners had started to write. Letters, which were officially allowed under the Geneva Convention, faced censorship, but were not completely prohibited. Each prisoner was allotted a specific number of pages each month, and most took advantage of this opportunity. Initially, the letters sent home were short, cautious, and encoded. They contained health updates, requests for minor items, and vague reassurances. Yet as time went on, the tone of the letters evolved. Some began to recount unusual experiences: concerts, American music, films, and dancing. At first, many recipients back in Germany found it hard to believe. "This is not what we were told," one soldier remarked in early 1945. "The Americans do not starve us. They treat us as their own. They even allow us to watch their movies." Another man cryptically noted, "We are still prisoners, but not of war. Now we are prisoners of ideas." Censors permitted many such statements to pass, perhaps deliberately, understanding the impact these letters could have. Families, wives, and friends back home, starving, bombed, and enduring blackouts, would read about camp dances in America and feel a shift within them. Whispers made their way back to Germany through the mail, indicating that prisoners in Texas were learning English, that men from the Wehrmacht were enjoying Benny Goodman, and that even those loyal to the Reich had begun to question their beliefs. In the barracks, receiving letters became a significant event. A man would open a pale blue envelope adorned with U.S. Army stamps and red censor ink, reading it aloud to his fellow inmates. Responses were composed slowly and with care, with some prisoners including drawings of musical instruments, film projectors, or dance scenes. Others transcribed lyrics from memory, frequently in a phonetic manner, requesting family members to attempt to locate the records if possible. However, beyond the written words, the most impactful discussions occurred late at night among bunkmates, softly spoken reflections after the lights were turned off. The type of conversation that begins with trivial matters and culminates in confessions. "I never realized that black men could perform like that," one of them whispered. "Back home, they would be unseen. I didn't believe Americans possessed such control, such emotion. I always thought freedom was an illusion, but now I am uncertain." These were not political discussions. They were epiphanies. Men who had been raised within a strict hierarchy, who had marched, shouted, and obeyed, were now observing American soldiers swing dancing during their off-duty hours, or strolling arm in arm with girls at local fairs. Activities that appeared both unusual and deeply human. Even more disconcerting was the awareness that this culture, once regarded as feeble and chaotic, had endured the war's most challenging years and was flourishing. Glenn Miller's music continued to play even after his enigmatic disappearance. Hollywood persisted in producing films. Americans continued to laugh, dance, and create love songs. One prisoner, previously a staunch party loyalist, confessed privately in a journal entry later discovered in post-war archives, "I do not love America, but I envy them, not for their weapons, nor their wealth, but for their lightness, their capacity to live without seeking permission. It frightens me because I cannot contest it." The war outside surged toward its climax. Allied forces advancing, Germany in disarray, cities devastated. Yet within these rural camps, a different form of collapse was occurring. The collapse of certainty. For many PSWs, the enchantment of ideology was being dismantled not through confrontation, but through exposure. Through swing bands in Kansas, through films under the stars, through the simple act of writing home, "I heard music today." It was unlike ours, but it was exquisite. The war concluded with the abruptness of a curtain dropping mid-performance. For 1 week, rumors spread throughout the barracks regarding Hitler's demise, the fall of Berlin, and Germany's capitulation. The following week, it became official. Prisoners congregated around radios or listened as guards read bulletins aloud. Some shed tears, while others remained silent. A few fainted in open fields, gazing at the sky. For months, they had existed in a limbo of barbed wire and swing music, trapped between two realities. Now the world they had known was no longer in existence. The world they had glimpsed through jazz, Hollywood, and laughter was not theirs to possess. Repatriation was a lengthy process involving paperwork, processing, and trains. However, the psychological journey had already commenced. The Americans, commendably, treated the returning prisoners with respect. Prior to their departure, many camps provided final cultural packages, including books, newspapers, and even jazz records for those who wished to take something with them. Some guards embraced their former captives, while others merely nodded. There was no formal ceremony, just a shared understanding. For the German prisoners of war, the journey home was both a physical and spiritual experience. They boarded ships filled not only with fellow soldiers but also with remnants of a culture that had quietly reshaped their perspectives. A harmonica nestled in a rucksack, a sketch of Fred Astaire copied from a magazine, a meticulously folded page of Duke Ellington lyrics written in broken German. Above all, memories of the night they danced. The first occasion they laughed at an American joke. The feeling of jazz enveloping them like rain after a drought. Upon returning to Germany, they found a nation reduced to ruins, cities charred, railways disrupted, and families scattered or missing. Yet, amidst the devastation, many carried something peculiar and intangible: rhythm. They had changed. Not all, not entirely, but in a profound way. Some became music educators, eager to delve into the very swing and jazz that had once been prohibited by the Reich. Others initiated film clubs, seeking out American classics through the black market. A few secured positions in newly established radio stations or cultural commissions created under Allied oversight. When asked what surprised them the most about their captivity in America, many former prisoners of war provided a similar response. They expressed their thoughts on democracy, not always with certainty, but rather with a sense of curiosity. Historians later observed this subtle transformation. Among the returning prisoners of war, particularly those who had been held in the United States, there was a notable increase in post-war democratic participation, while anti-Semitic sentiments were slightly diminished. Their exposure to American culture did not turn them into Americans, but it did foster skepticism towards totalitarian ideologies. They had experienced an alternative lifestyle, listened to it, and danced to its rhythm. In Dusseldorf, a former prisoner named Ernst began to perform jazz in local beer halls, having learned to play the clarinet at Camp Atterbury. In Leipzig, another individual named Karl opened a small cinema that exclusively showcased American films from the 1930s and 1940s, with his most popular double feature being Casablanca and Swing Time. He remarked that he appreciated the message of these films: everyone deserves a second chance. However, the effects of this exposure were not always overt. Often they resided quietly within them. A melody hummed during a walk home, a finger tapping to an invisible rhythm while waiting in line for rationed bread, or a private smile evoked by memories of a dance floor illuminated by hanging bulbs and guarded only by shadows. It was as if, in that fleeting moment between gunfire and Reconstruction, they had been granted the opportunity to experience freedom through music, cinema, and rhythm. Years later, when questioned about their post-war experiences, it was not the treatment they received or the vastness of the land that stood out, but rather the music. The irony of this situation was both bitter and poignant. A regime that had prohibited jazz and banned swing had sent its soldiers to war, only for them to be disarmed by the very sounds that the regime feared the most. Not through violence, but through the cry of a trumpet, the beat of a syncopated drum, and a love song played in the darkness.